Good evening and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be reading to you this book about the Philippines in a nice, soft spoken voice. The Philippines. I'll be reading to you these chapters: the introduction, the Philippines overview, where in the world is the Philippines, maybe some facts at a glance, early arrivals, Muslim encounters, the Spanish take control, the U.S. moves in, the aftermath, and the Philippines today. Introduction. Stretching like a hook pointed toward Australia, the Philippines is a country of islands lying at the eastern edge of Southeast Asia. In addition to the Philippines, Southeast Asia includes Myanmar, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, along with the island nations of Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, and East Timor. It is part of a region dominated by an archipelago, a stretch of water containing many islands. Known as the Malay Archipelago or the East Indian Archipelago, it is over 4,000 miles long from east to west and about 1,300 miles wide from north to south. It is the largest archipelago in the world. Lying between the Asian mainland and Australia, it includes Indonesia and the Philippines, along with some 25,000 islands. Like most countries in Southeast Asia, the Philippines was once a colony. Its people were governed by distant rulers in Spain for more than 350 years. In 1898, however, the country was taken over by the United States. Nearly 50 years later, in the aftermath of World War II and a short-lived Japanese occupation, the Philippines finally became a free and independent nation. Chapter 1. The Philippines Overview. Welcome to the Philippines. If you've ever imagined living on a deserted island, this country could be ideal. Although the Philippines is made up of over 7,000 islands, less than 1,000 of them are inhabited. That means fewer than 15% have any people living on them at all. Some 95% of the country's population lives on just 11, yep, I read that right, 11 on the largest islands. If the islands of the Philippines were pushed together, their land would be about the size of Nevada. Squeaky chairs here. Geographers divide the Philippines into three groups of islands. The southern group includes Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago. The majority of the country's islands are in the central group called the Visayas. Its major islands include Bohol, Cebu, Leyte, Negros, Panay, and Samar. The northern group includes Luzon, the largest island. Luzon is also the site of metropolitan Manila, made up of 16 separate cities, including Manila, the country's capital, and Quezon City, its largest city. Metro Manila is home to nearly 12 million people. The Philippines is actually the fastest growing country in Southeast Asia. Its population increased from 75 million in 2000 to almost 100 million in 2010. As of 2012, the median age in the Philippines was 23. That means half the people are younger than 23 and half older. Across the Philippines, over 170 different dialects are spoken by a wide variety of ethnic groups. A growing population means a greater demand for food, housing, and other essentials. It can be challenging to provide these needs. Still, the Philippines is blessed with many natural resources. With a warm tropical climate, the country receives plenty of rain. Most daytime temperatures climb over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions are ideal for growing crops such as sugarcane, rice, pineapples, bananas, and mangoes. In spite of their increasing numbers, Filipinos don't eat all the fruit they grow. Instead, they export the excess to other countries. This is a primary source of money for the Philippines. Besides fruit, the Philippines also exports tobacco, copper, gold, and a rope-making product known as abaca. Okay. Islands are actually mountains, with most of the land lying below the ocean surface. Most islands in the Philippines have similar features. Sandy beaches stretch along the shoreline, interrupted by bays and natural harbors. Further inland lie dense tropical rainforests. Closer to the center of most islands are hills and mountains. Luzon is home to the Cordillera Central Range, where some peaks reach 9,000 feet. Mount Apo, the country's tallest peak, is located on Mindanao and towers 9,692 feet. Like many of the mountains in the Philippines, Mount Apo is an active volcano. The Philippines is within the Ring of Fire. This is a horseshoe-shaped area some 25,000 miles long that extends completely around the rim of the Pacific Ocean from New Zealand to Chile. Over 90% of the world's earthquakes occur within the Ring of Fire. Along with most of the world's volcanic eruptions, the Philippines suffers from both. Although the Philippines has several minor earthquakes and volcanic eruptions each year, the early 1990s were particularly deadly. On July 16, 1990, a 7.7 magnitude earthquake centered in Luzon caused widespread destruction and killed 1,621 people. Every February since then, the town of Baguio, the summer capital of the Philippines, has put on the Pangambenga Festival to celebrate the town's many flowers and symbolize the rebuilding after the earthquake. It includes a parade with floats made out of flowers and street dancers dressed in flowers. As newspaper reporter Edu Jark observes, there were flowers and more flowers. Name it, and it was represented. I recall seeing roses of different hues, milleflores, whose sheer size amazed everyone, birds of paradise, carnations and golden mums, arthuriums and geraniums, vandas and dendrobiums, orchids from Phalaenopsis to cattleyas. The next year, on June 15th, Luzon's Mount Pinatubo erupted for the first time in over 400 years. It was one of the most violent eruptions anywhere in the world in the 20th century. A series of eruptions over a period of several days spewed volcanic ash 22 miles in the air, and hundreds of people died. Clark Air Base, established by the U.S. military in 1903, was damaged so badly that it was turned over to the Philippines. The eruption even had an effect on the Earth's climate. It's a cooler world now thanks to Mount Pinatubo, according to Science News. Mount Pinatubo ejected an estimated 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide gas into the stratosphere, where it formed tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. Such droplets, or aerosols, remained suspended in the upper atmosphere for several years following an eruption. Mount Pinatubo's aerosol cloud, which circled the globe within a few weeks, is of its emergence led scientists to speculate that incoming sunlight might be scattered or blocked, resulting in cooler temperatures on the ground. The following year, the speculation was confirmed. Temperatures in some places were nearly 2 degrees cooler than they would otherwise have been. Over time, layers of volcanic ash form a mineral-rich soil. This is another reason, along with the climate, for the country's agricultural success. Only about 1/3 of the country's land is used for farming, yet it produces enough to feed the population and provide generous exports. Even on hilly land, farmers carve terraces where they can grow rice, a primary staple for many people in the country. In many parts of the Philippines, people plant and harvest the crops as they have for hundreds of years, by hand, with the help of a plow pulled by a carabao, a type of water buffalo. Often called the national animal, the carabao is just one of many unusual creatures that live in and around the Philippine Islands. Nearly 200 species of mammals live in the Philippines. Some exist nowhere else on Earth. Because people have developed the habitats these animals call home, many of them are endangered. Although similar species exist across Asia, the Visayan spotted deer roams freely on only 3 islands in the Philippines. Less than 3,000 exist, and photos of them in the wild are extremely rare. Like many animals in the Philippines, it is nocturnal, preferring to eat at night. The nocturnal tarsier is related to the monkey. This small primate has huge eyes, a tiny body, and a very long hind limbs that look similar to a frog's. On the island of Bohol, the Philippine Tarsier and Wildlife Sanctuary lets visitors not only see the animals but also hold them in their hands. The tiny deer mouse and the leopard cat are among many other endangered animals on the Philippines. Although the Philippines were once covered by forests, over the past century many of the trees have been cut down to make more room for people and farms. Just like in many countries, young people often leave small towns and villages to work in cities. They spend their adulthood living very close to others. Thousands of years ago, the population was spread out. The people who settled on the islands had little contact with anyone beyond the shoreline. We'll skip the Philippines facts at a glance. Let's get on to the story. Chapter 2, Early Arrivals. Nothing compares to the Ati-Ati-Han annual festival on the island of Panay during the third week of January. According to the Lonely Planet guidebook, the elements of Ati-Ati-Han date back to the 13th century, when a group of light-skinned Malay immigrants from Borneo chose to show their regard for the local Ati people by painting their faces black and singing and dancing in thanks for the land and food that was offered to them. Worried about any pagan origins, the colonizing Spanish later added Santo Niño, or Baby Jesus, to the mix. The festival lasts for several days. It begins at dawn each day and lasts long after midnight. Body painters compete in contests while dancers in colorful costumes fill the streets. Part parade, part party, the Ati-Ati-Han is one of the biggest celebrations in the Philippines. It attracts hordes of locals and tourists who book every room in local hotels. The festival begins with a formal Catholic Mass. On the second day, groups representing different tribes compete for attention and prizes. Soot-covered celebrants imitate the Atis, or Aitas, the original settlers of the Philippines. The festival name actually means to be like the Atis. Today, members of the Ati tribe can still be found in the backwoods of Panay and other islands. 30,000 years ago, the first Atis migrated from the modern-day countries of Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand to the Philippines. Much of the world was frozen in an ice age, and even warmer climates felt its effects. Sea levels were lower. Areas that today are underwater were revealed, offering land bridges from the Malay Peninsula and the island of Borneo to the Philippine Islands. Tens of thousands of years ago, people did not farm. They did not raise animals. They survived by hunting and gathering, stalking prey and eating whatever they could find. It was an unpredictable way of life. When food supplies grew scarce, they moved on. Over time, the Atis moved further inland to the forests and the mountains, which offered better food supplies. They were particularly hard hit by the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. Many Ati villages were buried beneath several feet of ash. The inhabitants were forced into government-sponsored tent cities. As Sister Palazzo, a Catholic nun who spent years living among them, said, they really think of Mount Pinatubo as the mother who nursed them, bringing them water, the green forest, and the animals. This faith helped to sustain them during the crisis and believed that things would get better. Farmer Ernesto Abillon, who is half Ati, half Filipino, noted that, I don't believe that the soil is destroyed forever. It is just covered by a layer of sand and it can be taken away. I plan to live here when the volcano will go normal. I want to plant and harvest here, camote and banana. By the time the land bridges disappeared, buried beneath the ocean or eroded by water, many inhabitants lived far from the coast. The second wave of settlers consisted largely of fishermen and farmers. Sometime around 3200 BCE, they rowed on crude boats from China and the Malay Peninsula. These people spoke an early Malay language. They were also the island's first rice farmers. The crop thrived in shallow water, and it was grown both in lowland areas and on the island's hillsides. Tending and harvesting the crop led to early settlements and small villages devoted to its production. Around 1200 CE, large boats sailed from the island of Borneo. When they reached Panay, they formed a new community. Unlike earlier groups, the newcomers had a written language. Before then, the groups on the Philippines had an oral history. This means they told stories about how they came to the region and how the earliest people survived. The arrivals from Borneo had written laws and used money to buy goods. They were more advanced than the people who had been living in the Philippines for centuries. Usually, when more advanced civilizations encounter less advanced ones, the advanced civilization takes over. This did not happen. Although the two groups may have fought in the beginning, the Atis and the new arrivals soon helped each other. This is the origin of the Ati-Ati-Han, which celebrates the cooperation between the newcomers and Panay's natives. Despite getting along with the Atis, the groups that fled Borneo did not get along very well with each other. They often fought. On the mainland of Southeast Asia, small groups were taken over by larger ones. Eventually, empires were formed. This did not happen in the Philippines. Instead, the communities developing on the islands had limited contact with each other. Each small group developed its own languages and customs. Rather than developing complex forms of government, most natives kept their way of life quite simple. Power rested with the tribal leader or chief who made the decisions. By the time settlers from Borneo reached Panay, other islanders were trading with China and the Middle East. Other than a few records of trade between China and the northernmost islands, there is little information available about the Philippines before the 1500s. Still, by 1000 CE, traders came to the Philippines with more than goods. They brought a new religion as well. Chapter 3. Muslim Encounters. Because it is closer to Malaysia than to the larger islands of the Philippines, Seminole Island would often go unnoticed were it not for the Sheikh Karim Al Maktoum Mosque. The oldest mosque in the Philippines, it was named after the Arab trader who first built it out of logs and mud in 1380. A national treasure, the mosque today is a colorful display of green and white. The pillars from the original mosque rest inside. These pillars are a reminder of the beginnings of Islam in the Philippines. The first monotheistic religion in the Philippines, it would spread across the southern islands and reach all the way to Manila. Today, no matter what official religion Filipinos believe in, many of them are connected to a religion practiced thousands of years before Islam. Even in the 21st century, more than one-third of Filipinos still work on farms. Many of these rural Filipinos take comfort from this oldest belief system, which is known as animism. It is a religion that sees supernatural powers in nature, in rocks and caves, in the forests, and in the mountains. Animists believe powerful spirits control whether a crop has enough rain or endures a drought, whether seasonal monsoons will be helpful or deadly, and if a seemingly placid mountain will erupt into a deadly volcano. Native tribes across the world, including the Americas, have practiced forms of this belief. Filipinos still consult diwateros. These women claim to be able to tell what a spirit wants. In rural areas, Filipinos often carry an unting-unting, a good luck charm worn around the neck to ward off evil and bring good luck. Many people go to faith healers. These men and women pray for a victim of illness to get better. Faith healers in the Philippines are often Christian, but the practice began thousands of years before Christ's birth. Tribes living on the thousands of islands which became the Philippines freely worshipped as they wished for centuries. As outsiders began arriving, new religions were introduced. Before 1000 CE, traders from China may have brought Buddhism to the Philippines. This religion began in India and taught that the key to happiness was ending all desire. A few hundred years later, the first Muslim missionaries arrived. Although traders from the Middle East may have introduced Islam to the native tribes, these missionaries were the first group whose only goal was conversion. Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad was visited by the angel Gabriel in 610 CE. This angel gave him verses from God which became Islam's holiest book, the Quran. Believers see Muhammad as the last in a line of holy men, who included Moses and Jesus Christ. Even before Muhammad's death, there would be violent conflicts between the religion he founded and older religions like Christianity and Judaism. Still, Islam reached the southern edge of the Philippines relatively peacefully. It was here on Mindanao, along with the Sulu archipelago, that Islamic missionaries converted tribespeople. Sulu was the home of the first centralized government, as it was led by a sultan in 1450. As a sultanate, the religion's influence spread across the Philippines. The sultan would keep control of the southern portion of the Philippines until the early 1900s. Even today, parts of Mindanao and the other islands in the south are closed to outsiders. As Cesar Mahul, a distinguished professor at the University of the Philippines, observes, what gave the Muslims in the Philippines their cohesion and sense of community was Islam. It was Islam that institutionalized their loyalty to the sultans, gave them a system of writing, sanctioned their attempts to resist alien rule, and gave a religious character to their patriotism. Natives who did not want to convert to Islam often fled to the mountains. Further north, many more would flee when the first Europeans arrived. Led by one of Portugal's most famous explorers, these Europeans didn't just want trade or conversion. They wanted control. Chapter 4. The Spanish take control. The ancient fort looms over the mouth of the Pasig River. Close to the cobblestone streets and shops of Intramuros, the oldest part of Manila, Fort Santiago is a popular draw for the city's visitors. Built more than 400 years ago, it remains as a monument to Spanish power. The fort's walls are scarred and worn, but otherwise little changed from their completion in 1590. Almost 1,000 years ago, the inventions, silks, and spices of China were carried over a land route known as the Silk Road. The goods made their way to Venice, Italy, where local merchants sold them across Europe. Other European countries like the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain began seeking a water route to Asia as an alternative to the Venetian dominance or trade from that region. The Venetian dominance of trade from that region. In the 1400s, Portuguese explorers sailed deep into the Atlantic Ocean. Expeditions sponsored by Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors sailed along the coast of Africa and beyond. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the tip of Africa and sailed all the way to India. 5 years earlier, Pope Alexander IV had divided New World discoveries between Spain and Portugal. On June 7, 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas created an imaginary line between the Cape Verde Islands, controlled by Portugal, and Hispaniola, where Christopher Columbus had claimed for Spain. The treaty did more than ignore the claims of competing European powers. It ignored any people who lived on land the countries might claim. In 1529, the Treaty of Zaragoza did the same thing for the other side of the world. The Philippines lay within the area of Spanish control. Although Ferdinand Magellan was Portuguese and had even helped in his country take control of Malacca in Malaysia, by 1517 he was ready to help Spain. Spanish King Charles V supported Magellan's quest to discover if ships could reach Asia by sailing west as well as east. Perhaps the king hoped there would be spice-producing islands within Spanish territory. Spices were especially important in this era. They helped preserve food, served as medicines, and disguised foul odors. The most sought-after spices were in Asian islands. Setting sail with 5 ships on September 20th, 1519, Magellan left Spain. He sailed down the east coast of South America, crossed the Pacific, and reached the Philippines on March 17th, 1521. His 2 remaining ships anchored off the coast of Samar. Magellan claimed the land for Spain. He immediately set about converting the natives to Christianity. Although Magellan succeeded in converting a number of locals, including several tribal chiefs, he made the mistake of backing one of these chiefs in an ongoing war. Magellan and 48 men went ashore to attack Lapu-Lapu, the opposing chief. Antonio Pigafetta, one of Magellan's men, described what happened next. When we reached the land, the natives had formed 3 divisions to the number of more than 1,500 people. When they saw us, they charged down upon us with exceeding loud cries. They all hurled themselves upon Magellan. One of them wounded him on the left leg with a large cutlass, which resembles a scimitar, only being larger. That caused the captain to fall face downward, when immediately they rushed upon him with iron and bamboo spears and with their cutlasses. Today, many Filipinos regard Lapu-Lapu as their first national hero because of his resistance to the Spanish invaders. The death of Magellan barely slowed the Spanish conquest. In 1543, Ruy Lopez de Villalobos again claimed the island chain for Spain. He named it after the country's crown prince Felipe, calling it Las Islas Filipinas. The Spanish occupation of the region began in earnest 22 years later with the arrival of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. Landing in Cebu, another island in the Visayan chain, he established a fort and a church. Legazpi had reached the Philippines from Mexico, where he had used harsh methods to control the natives opposing Spain. In the Philippines, he used the same tactics, using his army to win battles against the Muslims. In 1571, he overcame a Muslim fort in an immense natural harbor on Luzon Island that he called Ciudad Insigne y Siempre Leal, which is Spanish for distinguished and ever-loyal city. This lengthy name never caught on. Instead, people began calling it by the native word for mangrove, Manilad. Today we know it as Manila. Manila was the ideal harbor for the growing trade between China and Spain. Once a year, Chinese junks docked at Manila. They unloaded silks and other goods. Since the Chinese only accepted silver as payment, galleons loaded with silver from Spanish-controlled mines in Central and South America sailed from Acapulco, Mexico. The Philippines would be used primarily as a port until the 1800s. Only then would the Spanish begin exploiting its natural resources, exporting minerals such as gold, silver, and tin, along with coffee and tobacco and exotic fruits like mangoes, pineapples, and bananas. Exploration was about more than discovering new trade routes and claiming land. The Catholic Church saw part of its mission as encouraging explorers to go into areas unvisited by Europeans and convert locals to Christianity. Today, the sunny peach-colored exterior of Manila's San Agustin Church reflects the bright palettes of the tropics. The gray stone monastery and convent, along with its lofty interiors, seem to reflect the power of the Catholic Church. Built in 1571, St. Augustine is the oldest stone church in the Philippines. The church's founders arrived with Legazpi. Like other churches in the Philippines, San Agustin was self-supporting. Spain provided the churches with land, which they used for growing crops. Priests were the natives' primary source of education for several centuries as Catholic leaders built and ran schools across the Philippines. They also established hospitals. There is yet another legacy. As authors Alfredo Rosas and Grace Rosas explains, to Christianize Filipinos, Spanish missionaries drew them into population centers. A program of putting potential converts under church bells was vigorously pursued, thus leading to the formation of towns with the church as their center, the populace within hearing distance of its bells. The bigger the bells, the larger the community. No other country in Southeast Asia was dominated by a colonizer's religion like the Philippines. More than 400 years after the first priest arrived, today over 90% of Filipinos are Christian. The vast majority are Catholic. Despite native anger towards Spain, the locals held onto their new faith. Once Fort Santiago and other forts were completed, Muslim influence in the central and northern islands disappeared. Islam remained strong across the southern portion of the Philippines. No matter how powerful the Spanish became, they could not take over this region. A few natives resisted both the Christian and the Muslim missionaries, fleeing the low-lying coastal areas for remote mountains. The central portions of larger islands like Luzon remained unexplored until the 1800s. Here, tribes maintained a way of life untouched by outside influences. The reputation of some of those tribes as headhunters was so frightening that most outsiders avoided the regions they controlled. The Spanish altered the lives of the island's natives, calling them Indios. They were not considered the equal of the Spanish who took their land, then forced them to work on it for very low wages. The Spanish even taxed the money the natives earned working on land they had once owned. The way the Spanish treated the natives unified the tribes. Before their arrival, they had little contact with each other. Each tribe viewed itself as unique. The Spanish gave the natives their first sense of belonging to a country. By creating the Philippines, the Spanish inspired natives to see themselves as Filipinos. Because it was so valuable, the Philippines was highly sought after. Over the next 3 centuries, Spain fought with the Chinese, the Japanese, the Dutch, and the English, along with Muslims, for control of the islands. Spain won all these battles. Yet the hardest battles would not be fought against fellow colonizers, but against natives who dreamed of freedom. By the late 1800s, natives looked to the example of the United States, a place where people could vote and where an ideal of limited government gave the poor opportunities to become rich. Yet for many Filipinos, the U.S. would become yet another occupier rather than a symbol of freedom. Chapter 5. The U.S. moves in. The battleship USS Maine had been anchored in the harbor of Havana, Cuba for several weeks in early 1898. On the night of February 15th, an explosion ripped through the ship. Most of the sailors were asleep. The blast destroyed most of the ship's forward third. 266 men died in the disaster. Afterwards, several investigations were unable to discover the reason for the explosion. Across the United States, newspapers and their readers blamed Spain, which had controlled Cuba since the early 1500s, for the catastrophe. In the Philippines, Spanish control had been steadily weakening. For over a century, natives had been fighting against the colonizers. Although it occurred nearly halfway around the world, the explosion of the Maine would soon provide the catalyst for their overthrow. Southeast Asia's nationalist movement was born in the Philippines. A movement driven by a desire for independence and their own nation, it was sometimes strengthened by Spanish influence. Foreign trade helped elite Filipinos grow wealthy. They were able to send their children overseas to be educated at the best schools. When they returned, they brought new ideas about government and their country's future. Despite their education, most had few opportunities besides assisting the Spanish. Filipino priests were unable to join religious orders controlled by the Spanish. In 1872, 3 native priests were executed for preaching against Spanish control. Educated Filipinos looked to the United States as a model. After all, the U.S. had been a colony of England until declaring independence in 1776. In the last decade of the 19th century, the independence movement gained strength. An office clerk named Andres Bonifacio helped to form Katipuan, or Sons of the People, one of the main organizations promoting Filipino independence. A rivalry developed between Bonifacio and a local chief, Emilio Aguinaldo, who was opposed to violence. He wanted to see Katipuan inspire political reforms and viewed the U.S. system as ideal. Despite Aguinaldo's opposition to violence, after his supporters elected him president of the organization, they executed Bonifacio. Spanish leaders were worried. Aguinaldo was promised reforms if he left the country. He agreed, relocating to Hong Kong along with a number of his supporters. The reforms never happened. Meanwhile, another champion of independence had matched Aguinaldo's fame. José Rial was a doctor and scientist who wrote novels challenging Spanish rule and promoting nationalism. Because his work was seen as a serious threat to Spanish control, in 1896 he was executed by a firing squad. The execution only served to further inflame Filipino anger. His legacy continues to this day. No self-respecting town in the country is without a statue of the man, or does not have a major street named after him, notes guidebook author Ralph Jennings. Reverence for thinker Dr. José Rizal, who died a martyr at age 35 in the last years of Spanish rule, has spanned a century and spread to foreign lands. As was the case in the Philippines, Cuban revolutionaries were attacking Spanish control of their island. The Maine had been sent to Havana to protect U.S. citizens as violence increased. The U.S. declared war on Spain on April 25, 1898, just over 2 months after the explosion. On May 1st, Commodore George Dewey led a U.S. fleet into Manila Bay against an overmatched Spanish fleet. The Spanish ships were destroyed without the combat loss of a single American life. That month, Aguinaldo returned to the Philippines. This time he had the U.S. as an ally in his fight against Spain. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo declared the Philippines as independence. In August, the war ended. Another one was right around the corner. For $20 million, the U.S. bought the Philippines from Spain while also gaining control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and Cuba's Guantanamo Bay. Although the U.S. promised the Filipinos they would gain independence, Aguinaldo and his supporters worried that it was just one more lie from a powerful country. Now in control of the Philippine Army, he launched an attack against U.S. forces in Manila on February 4, 1899. The U.S. victory over Spain had been quick and decisive. This new war against the Philippines dragged on for over 3 years. More than 4,000 Americans and 20,000 Filipinos died in the conflict. Aguinaldo was finally captured by U.S. forces in March of 1901 and swore an oath of allegiance to the U.S. The war ended soon afterward. At one point, Aguinaldo was so discouraged that he said his soldiers had died without making any difference on future events. That opinion may not have been entirely correct. The U.S. quickly set a long-term timeline for Philippine independence, with an official date set for 1944. In the meantime, the country's elite officials and landowners gave their support to the Americans. Under civilian governor and future U.S. President William Howard Taft, steps were undertaken to prepare Filipinos for self-rule. Compulsory education was instituted, requiring the young to attend school, and a national health program began. By 1935, the Philippines had a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution when Manuel L. Quezon became the first president elected by the Commonwealth government. Dreams of independence, however, would soon be delayed. On November 26, 1941, 6 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers headed to sea. Their destination was the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The carriers were accompanied by fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, along with tankers for refueling during the Pacific crossing. Just before 8 o'clock a.m. on December 7th, the first attack wave struck. A second wave followed soon after. Before the morning was out, 5 of the 8 U.S. battleships in the harbor were sinking or sunk. Most American combat planes were smoking ruins, and over 2,400 Americans were killed. The United States responded by declaring war, joining the conflict which would be known as World War II. The day after the attack, the Japanese bombed Singapore and landed troops on southern Thailand and northern Malaysia. The Japanese also had their eyes on the Philippines. The survivors were still being fished out of the water at Pearl Harbor when it was the island's turn to face the Japanese onslaught. Chapter 6. Aftermath. The Japanese attack on the Philippines began with bombing air bases near Manila, virtually wiping out American air power. 2 weeks later, more than 40,000 Japanese troops swarmed ashore on Luzon. They easily pushed American and Filipino forces into the Bataan Peninsula, located on the western edge of Manila Bay. For almost 3 months, the defenders gradually gave ground to the much better equipped Japanese troops. Food and ammunition supplies dwindled. Disease was rampant. After surrendering in April 1942, over 10,000 Americans and 60,000 Filipinos were forced to march more than 60 miles under blazing sunlight to a prison camp. They were given very little food and water. Many died from the heat and dehydration. Others were executed by Japanese soldiers. By the time they arrived at the prisoner of war camp, more than 7,000 had died. This atrocity became infamous as the Bataan Death March. The following month, the final American garrison in Corregidor Island fell to the invaders. The commander of the U.S. and Philippine forces, General Douglas MacArthur, had evacuated the islands under the orders of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He promised to return. It would be well over 2 horrific years before he could keep his promise. Conditions were scarcely better for those left behind. Although many Filipino political leaders helped the invaders, most people in the Philippines viewed these leaders as puppets, controlled by the Japanese. The new occupiers treated Filipinos worse than the Spanish colonizers. They forced many people to work long hours and abused those who didn't. The country's growing Chinese population was singled out for especially brutal treatment. Many of them were tortured or even killed. Although the Japanese declared the country independent, this term meant almost nothing. Japanese interests overwhelmed any potential freedoms. In response to their harsh treatment, some Filipinos, often under the command of American soldiers who had fled into the jungles instead of surrendering, conducted guerrilla warfare on the occupiers. The United States had entered World War II following an early morning attack. They ended the war the same way. In August of 1945, U.S. planes dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Japan surrendered. Honoring a pledge made decades earlier, the U.S. granted Philippine independence and self-rule on July 4, 1946. General MacArthur said that America had buried imperialism on that day. The Philippines was the first constitutional democracy in Asia and one of the first colonies after World War II to win self-rule. Most colonies did not become independent until years later. For Filipinos, the years following independence were filled with challenges. With so many leaders suspected of aiding the Japanese occupiers, General MacArthur reassured voters that longtime politician Manuel Rojas was not one of them. In 1946, Rojas was elected president of the Philippines. The United States provided millions of dollars in economic aid and maintained 2 important military bases in the Philippines, Clark Air Base and U.S. Naval Base Subic Bay. American companies also enjoyed trade protections. Yet for poor Filipinos, life was little changed from before the war. Landowners still held the country's political power and wealth. There were few opportunities or privileges for the men and women who worked on the land. Divisions between those with money and those without helped fuel a communist uprising. In 1948, the Hukbalahaps, primarily peasant farmers living in central Luzon, began fighting Filipino military forces. They used violence, trying to convince Filipino leaders to divide the country's large estates among poor farmers. Worried about a communist takeover, the United States provided military support to the government. Philippine Secretary of Defense Ramon Magsaysay began a series of reforms to help the poor in the 1950s. These reforms, along with U.S. military support, ended the Hukbalahap Rebellion in 1954. Magsaysay had been elected president the previous year. During Magsaysay's presidency, he instituted pro-growth policies which improved the average Filipino standard of living by attracting businesses. Taking advantage of the prosperity that followed the end of World War II, many people in the U.S. and across the world began buying everything from cars to television sets. Countries that had factories with inexpensive workers or essential raw materials benefited from this increased buying. The Philippines offered both. By 1957, the Philippines' rate of growth was second only to Japan among Asian countries. The horrors of war and the economic turmoil which followed were receding. Then tragedy struck. On March 17th, Magsaysay's plane crashed in Cebu. Vice President Carlos P. Garcia served until 1961 when his vice president, Diosdado Magapagal, was elected president. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos won the presidency. Even though the Constitution limited him to serving 2 four-year terms, Marcos ruled for more than 20 years. He used the power of his presidency to enrich himself and his friends. His wife Imelda was a former beauty queen who became well known for her wealthy lifestyle. She was especially noted for her vast collection of shoes, many of which were worth hundreds of dollars a pair. Even as Marcos grew rich, the country grew poorer. Its place as an economic power slipped. Despite growing opposition to his presidency, the United States continued providing economic and military support. U.S. leaders were more concerned about a communist resurgence than Marcos's brutal leadership. In 1969, Marcos was re-elected. During his second term, Muslims in the southern islands demanded independence. Marcos sent his army into the region to put down numerous uprisings across Mindanao. At the same time, communists had reorganized as the New People's Army. They began attacking military installations and fought with the army in the jungles of Luzon. In 1972, Marcos declared a national emergency and put the country under martial law. He abolished Congress while suspending a newly written constitution. He restricted labor parties and political groups which opposed him while taking control of the media. He would be president until the crisis ended. It lasted over a decade. During the 1970s, the price of oil, an important Philippine import, increased. Many of the country's exports, however, commanded a lower price. The combination of economic and political uncertainty created unrest. Some people publicly protested his presidency while others wrote about the country's problems. By the 1980s, the Philippines was being called the sick man of Asia. The country was drowning in debt, money lent to it by other governments, which included the United States. By then, hundreds of Marcos's opponents had been imprisoned and even killed, yet despite the dangers, 2 men consistently spoke out against him. Manila's Cardinal Jaime Sin was the Catholic Church's leader in the Philippines. Most members of his congregation were poor. He spoke about how hard their lives were under the Marcos regime and pushed for change. While Sin spoke for the country's Catholic majority, Benigno Aquino Jr. represented hope for voters. Elected as a senator in 1967, many expected that Aquino would become president after Marcos served 2 terms in 1973. Instead, Marcos extended his presidency. He also accused Aquino of supporting the rebels in Luzon. Aquino was imprisoned for 7 years on murder charges, but was allowed to travel to the U.S. for heart surgery in 1980. 3 years later, he returned to the Philippines. Aquino was leaving his plane at the Manila airport when shots rang out. Marcos's most powerful opponent crumpled to the ground. His killer, Rolando Galman, was shot to death. Although Marcos was blamed for the assassination, it was never proven. Images of Aquino's bullet-riddled body led TV newscasts and gained front-page coverage of newspapers across the world. Aquino was seen as a martyr who had died in the cause of his people's freedom. In the Philippines, supporters flooded the streets protesting Marcos and accusing him of responsibility for Aquino's death. Marcos held on to power for 2 more years. During this time, Cardinal Sin comforted Aquino's grieving widow, Corazon. He motivated her to make what some considered a reckless choice. She ran for the presidency of the Philippines. Right from the start, she encountered a significant problem. The Marcos-controlled media refused to give her equal access. Cardinal Sin's regular radio addresses on the Catholic radio station calling for the people to support her became a critical tool to rally millions to her side, the New York Times reported. He became known in Manila as the unseen general who handed down on earth orders from above. The 1986 election was riddled with fraud, voter intimidation, and violence. Although Aquino won the popular vote, Marcos's supporters in the National Assembly voted that he should remain president. In the streets of Manila and across the country, Aquino supporters joined with Catholics to protest. Corazon Aquino did all she could to keep the protests peaceful. The protests reached a peak in late February. Hundreds of Aquino supporters marched down EDSA, a major Manila street. Their path was blocked by the Philippine Army armed with guns and tanks. The protesters were armed only with signs and flowers. Bloodshed seemed inevitable. Chapter 7. The Philippines Today. Facing off against the Philippine Army, the front lines of what was known as the People's Power Revolution was made up of priests and nuns. They kneeled before the soldiers and began to pray. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the army controlled by Ferdinand Marcos stood down. The people had won. Corazon Aquino, affectionately known as Cory, was sworn in as president on February 25, 1986. Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda fled the country. He died 3 years later in Hawaii. Imelda eventually returned to the Philippines, where she was elected to the House of Representatives several times. According to some estimates, her family may have amassed a fortune of $10 billion US, much of it money given from the US to help the Philippine people. The year after Aquino became president, a new constitution was implemented. It was the country's fifth since 1898. The new constitution limited the president to a single 6-year term. The vice president could serve 2. The constitution also provided for freedom of speech and of religion and the right to a fair trial. Despite the excitement for the election, the Aquino administration faced numerous challenges. There was a major earthquake and a volcanic eruption. There were half a dozen attempts to overthrow her. Yet during her term, the country's rate of growth climbed. She helped attract more foreign investment and privatized many businesses that had been controlled by Marcos and his friends in the government. As Philippine Star columnist Elfren S. Cruz noted when she died, for 17 years after her presidency, Cory was not just a former president. She was the moral conscience of the Filipino people. She was the only person who could call the people to the streets to express public outrage against the machinations and corruption of even the highest and most powerful politicians. Her successor, Fidel Ramos, oversaw increased growth as well when he lowered tax rates and sold large government-run industries like banking and oil to private companies. Although the Philippines suffered during an economic crisis in 1998 and another in 2008, overall it recovered faster than many other countries in the region. The election of former movie star Joseph Estrada in 1998 was a setback for the country. In many ways, he governed as Marcos had, giving prime jobs to his friends and stealing from the government. In 2001, he was removed from office. Estrada's vice president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, became president. In 2004, she won election to the office. Although the economy improved, the country faced numerous challenges. Muslim Moros in the south continued fighting against the Philippine government. Today, the U.S. Embassy advises travelers to avoid this region because of its dangers. The Philippines remains one of the poorest countries in Asia. Many of its citizens remain out of work, while the poor in the cities often live in rundown government housing or crudely built shacks. Still, more than 90% of Filipinos can read and write, far more than in many other poor countries. 1/4 of all Filipinos attend college, such as the privately run University of the East in Manila. The country is investing in education and high tech in hopes of attracting more foreign business. The country has a growing art scene as well. Beginning after World War II, numerous low-budget movies had been made in the Philippines. American movie producers often use the jungle as a setting and sometimes involve the country's army in stunts with gunfights and helicopters. Although the country's mainstream movie studios have declined since the 1990s, independent films from the Filipinos have won awards and worldwide audiences, and there are signs that the industry may be undergoing a revival. Yam Laranes, a noted Filipino director, says that there's been a revolution in technology. 10 years ago, few people could afford to make an independent film in the Philippines. A non-traditional story was not economically viable. Things are changing. A lot of independent directors and studios are making innovative films because the costs are so much lower, it is less of a risk. In 2010, Benigno Noynoy Aquino III, the son of Benigno and Corazon Aquino, was elected president. In 2012, he signed a peace agreement with the Moros, hoping to end further bloodshed in the area. The economy grew by over 6%, while private investment grew. Many remain hopeful that he will fulfill the promise of his parents. And that's going to be the end tonight. I'm going to skip this last chapter. Here we go. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good night. Good night.